Hey hey yaha. Hey hey ah. Hey hey.
This should be played at high volume, preferably in a residential area.
Non-10. Whoop.
Boo.
Sure. All right, so you can have that. I think we just open it up. I mean, I was told, kind of flip-flop, but I was told that just recently that we're doing about 7 to 8 minutes. All right.
I'm not as memorable as I think.
It's not necessarily enforceable.
All right, we're good. Can you hear me? All right, we're going to get started with our next panel. We're going to go quickly because we've been asked to end as close to 5 as possible to keep us on schedule. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Silke Kassner. You see her details up here, athlete Germany. Silke.
Thank you, Rogers. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for playing the game today to speak here as an athlete and athlete representative here in Eindhoven. Yeah, as you can see, I headlined Anti-Doping and Governance, Time for Athletes to Take Destiny into Their Own Hands. Let me tell you, as athletes, we're doing our sport highly intrinsic motivated. This is our power to become one of the best in the world in our sport. On our way to the international top level as professional athletes, we accept many regulations already given by sport structure and sport organizations. As an athlete, I accept and sign the World Anti-Doping Code. This enables me to compete on international level in my sport. Signing the code, I learned to be available and during for irregular, unannounced doping controls. I accept cuts to my personal freedom, always providing Adams with my private information to secure my whereabouts. All to be available at any time for unannounced doping control. It includes unpleasant procedures in giving blood and peeing in a small cup, pants to my knees, while being watched. In other life situations, this would be highly inappropriate. As athletes, we take the whole procedure into account, because we permanently have to prove that our performance is clean. We struggle against a general suspicion day by day. We feel constantly pursued. That makes the difference between the athlete and the official. 3 years ago, the world got to know about the state-sponsored doping system in Russia, for sure, the greatest doping scandal in sport history. As athletes representatives in Germany, we followed up the anti-McLaren report, of course, the Independent Pound Commission, and the journalistic investigation, of course. And as German athletes, we were really shocked and felt concerned about the health and the rights of the Russian athletes, who cannot be blamed in what system and country they were born. The sport organizations, especially the IOC, then were in the role to decide whether the Russian team may compete or not in the Olympic Games in Rio. Among all research and evidence, the IOC decided not to exclude the Russians. Furthermore, they called 2 commissions to examine the given information about the Sochi Games. This decision was based on that athletes couldn't be blocked on a collective punishment, but only on individual justice. And that's it. Reflecting this and the current step-by-step publication of the Oswald Commission, we understand that the IOC is keeping distance from applying the core principle of the WADA Code, the strict liability. In the retrospective, Russian athletes were not requested to be available for unannounced doping controls or any documentation of their testing by their anti-doping organization. Until today, it seemed that our general accepted and unique regulations to keep a doping-free sport is not applied in Russia. But on the other hand, athletes, NATO's, countries worldwide, keep their daily sport and anti-doping business. In fact, that no one is talking about, it is the fact that no one is talking about the strict liability and the reversal of evidence anymore. In view of enormous sanction by WADA Code, a national anti-doping law in Germany, and questioning former results of the Olympic Games, we took initiative as German athletes to approach the IOC with several statements and position papers. We even offered to speak in person. We described our view on a future anti-doping system, which is free from conflict of interests. And since August 2015, we claim an independent anti-doping system, a stronger position for WADA, and even a 3-power separation in anti-doping management. 3 years following the whole scene, we do not feel accepted by the IOC. as the main stakeholders in sport. We don't feel protected as athletes able to compete in clean competitions. We feel powerless, frustrated, unable to act and not being heard. The WADA code is the principle and the requirement to protect clean sports. We want a worldwide binding regulation that provides international equality in the fight against doping. We want everybody and every institution that the rules are respected and applied. Otherwise, we will shut down the strict liability, the WADA code, and close the WADA in Montreal. If the application of the rules is not guaranteed, we close our National Court of Arbitration and the CAS as well, and bring all cases before our ordinary public courts. Then all this is no longer needed. But we have all these achievements that distinguish sport from other law and rules. This all makes entirely sense to ensure a clean level playing field, and it is at present without any alternative. Coming from this, German athletes discussed the entire situation and the future of sports. We believe in the unifying power of sports, but the credibility of sport is severely damaged, and we lost confidence in the international sports system. We can see that the public is turning back from the organized sport and the Olympic movement. The doping scandal, corruption affairs, and a half-full audience during the Olympic Games was a distraction from competition, an actual reason why athletes go into Olympics. This all shakes our confidence and the values of sports. The structure is the problem. The entire construction of the sports system is a pyramid. The much broader bottom is the athlete, the protagonist of the competition. But we are far away from decisions that affect us. Today we conclude that many former decisions cannot be explained to an athlete. Because of that, we want to be significantly involved, demand more documentation and transparency in any decision-making process that affect our life and our sport. For this, it is important that athletes stand in solidarity and represent their concerns professionally. Therefore, the German athletes and the Athletes Commission had the urge to empower the solidarity in founding an independent organization in Germany. That all happened today, 6 weeks ago. The new institution, Athleten Deutschland, Athlete Germany, is the foundation for a professional network of German athletes. It shall become a service institution for athletes-related issues. It shall be the center to organize the athletes' involvement in all athlete-related processes and decisions from the start. We want no decision without the athlete. In Germany, we are nearly 9,000 athletes competing on the international level and listed at NATO Germany in Olympic, non-Olympic, and Paralympic sports. We will group up step by step now. We no longer want to be a fig leaf in a statue or a significant minority in a board. As the central stakeholder in sport, we want to play the role we deserve. That's our right according to democratic principles. We encourage athletes worldwide to do the same, to show solidarity and to speak up for their rights. And in this part, I really want to thank Julia and Vitaly Stepanov, who really encouraged us to go this way. Richard McLaren for his work and investigations in Russia, as well as Becky Scott, and the WADA Athletes Committee, and the NATO Committee for their leadership in anti-doping. So thank you, everybody.
All right, we're going to take questions for the panel after the speakers. Next is Travis Tygart, CEO of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency.
Thanks. It's great to be here. And first, thank you, Silke, for your comments. Takes a lot of courage, I know, for athletes to stand up and vocalize positions on things of great importance. And frequently, they get criticized by people in power for doing so. So congratulations to you and certainly continue to do that as it fits. And it's obviously an honor for me to be on the panel as well with personal hero of mine, Dick Pound. So thanks for the invitation, Jens, and thanks to the entire team, Christina, Maria, for all the logistical support and helping me get here. We've got, I guess, about 7 minutes to give kind of introductory remarks, and then I'm really looking forward to more engagement and discussion on the panel with the other panelists as well as the audience. So thank you for that time. I've titled this, as you can probably see, Foxes in the Hen House, Don't Clean Athletes Deserve an Independent and Strengthened World Anti-Doping Agency. And I guess I'll start with a quote many of you are probably familiar with now, which is, to change or be changed? That is the question, end quote. It's been nearly 3 years now since IOC President Thomas Bach made that emphatic statement in announcing the Agenda 2020 program. And the question, quite honestly, has never been more relevant for clean athletes as the time we stand now. The irony is that the decision to change or be changed now falls squarely on the IOC's own feet. To further quote that day, the Olympic movement is all about the clean athletes, the IOC leader stated on December 8, 2014. They are our best ambassadors. They are our role models. They are our treasure. Therefore, we have first and foremost to protect the clean athletes. And so now's the chance. We can walk the talk, or we can again fail to take action on behalf of those clean athletes. To further quote, we have to protect them from doping, match fixing, manipulation, and corruption. Speaking again of clean athletes, we have to change our way of thinking. We have to consider every single cent in the fight against these evils, not as an expense, but as an investment in the future of Olympic sport. All of this, of course, does and should beg the question, what does the investment in the future of Olympic sport look like for clean athletes? The IOC, as you've heard already today, has struggled, to put it lightly, taking definitive action to protect clean athletes since the Russian doping scandal came to light. Shockingly, the WADA Athletes Committee Chair, as well as the IOC Athletes Committee Chair, in a letter in 2016 stated, quote, athlete confidence in the anti-doping system in WADA and in the IOC has been shattered. You heard similar sentiments from Silke just a few minutes ago. So how did we get to this point of possibly revisiting and reliving history that we saw 15 months prior to Rio? I think, unfortunately, the answer lies in a weakened WADA and an indecisive IOC, seemingly more concerned about controlling and containing bad press and damage control than the interests of clean athletes. A roadmap to anti-doping respectability lives with a collective global effort for strong governance, true independence, and appropriate and swift justice. It's time to put an end to the practice of having the foxes stand guard over the hen house. Russian institutionalized doping has followed a predictable pattern for much of the last decade. While Russian officials continue to declare both innocence and compliance, the overwhelming body of evidence has been building, frankly, since 2008. And what we've seen is a highly orchestrated cover-up operation ranging from urine substitution, sample swapping, to brash use of steroid-laced alcohol cocktails, all financed and coordinated by the Russia Minister of Sports office. Consider this. Of the 82 medals that Team Russia took home from London 2012, at least 15 of those medal winners were later found to have used prohibited substances. The mirage continued at the gold rush in Sochi, where the home team's medal count of 33 total medals, the #1 placement. Today, 10 of those medals, including 4 gold, have been revoked. How many moments were stolen? How many Olympic dreams were shattered? Despite this, out of the Russia doping scandal, 2 silver linings have clearly emerged. The first, as you just heard from Silke, more than ever before, athletes are mobilizing, they're using their voice, they're finding the courage to stand up and speak out for their rights. And second, with these athletes taking the lead, we, I think, all have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to disrupt entrenched positions for the good of clean athletes and the future of sport, to make sure that the kind of state-supported doping we saw in Russia is never allowed again to rear its ugly head. To get there, the road to reform starts with independence. A system that is armed not just to say there is drug testing for sport brand value and to make athletes feel good, like there's actually something going on. But we have to move this to actually winning this battle for clean athletes so that every athlete knows that they can win clean and that any other victory is not truly an Olympic victory. The inherent problems that plague the global anti-doping system are actually pretty basic. The most vital principle of an effective system is that it must be free from the influence of conflicted sport governing bodies. It must be independent. We've heard a little bit about independent already this morning, or this afternoon, my morning, our afternoon. We at USADA, living in the trenches on this issue, have long advocated for a clear separation between those who promote sport and those who police it. Because it is really, really tough to make decisions against our sporting heroes, even when they deserve to have 7 Tour de France's removed, or 5 medals like Marion Jones had removed. That is not an easy day. And trust me, I've been there. To do otherwise is simply having the fox guarding the henhouse. It's likely that the Russian state-supported doping scandal would have been exposed sooner by the good men and women at WADA had its governance not been hamstrung by its own lack of true independence. Clean athletes, along with 37 national anti-doping organizations, many of whom are in this room, around the world support a strong but reformed World Anti-Doping Agency. We all also agree we need WADA reform from the status quo to truly become independent, a global regulator, not merely the sports service organization that many, both at WADA and in international sport, hope it remains. As it stands, half of WADA's 38-member foundation board and its 12-person executive committee is selected by the Olympic sports movement. These sports members are not mere figureheads, but are lifetime sport executives with long and distinguished careers and tremendous legacies in the promotion of sport. But they have strong incentives to influence WADA decisions to advance those sport interests, which is to promote sport. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with the promotion of sport. Putting fans in the seats, raising revenues, selling TV rights. That's what sport promoters do. But to uncover the dirty, ugly side of sport is in direct conflict with the promoting aspects. One IOC leader who simultaneously sat on WADA's board for years expressed his position on clean sport to the New York Times in November of 2016 by stating, quote, "We need to stop pretending sport is clean. It's a noble principle, but in practice, it's entertainment, it's drama." While surprisingly open and candid, and I think is spot on to what a sport administrator truly believes, it's not the type of independent governance that clean athletes deserve or that they expect. The good news is this conflicted governance model could easily be solved by removing the sport leaders from the governing body that makes material anti-doping decisions. The fix for the IOC is just as simple. The IOC today could make the decision and remove itself and other sports from critical anti-doping functions and commit to properly finance the fight. We remain optimistic. Over the past few months, national anti-doping organizations, as I mentioned, and athletes have put forward specific proposals. Very quickly, remove the fundamental conflict that exists when you try to promote and police your own sport. Strengthen WADA through improved independence, transparency, and increased investment. Number 3, increase and make clear WADA's ability to investigate, monitor compliance, and impose sanctions. 4, provide the opportunity for athletes who have been robbed to a meaningful recognition, including the swift allocation of any medals. And then lastly, increase support for whistleblowers around the world. In that 2014 address, the IOC president said, if we want our values of Olympism, the values of excellence, respect, friendship, dialogue, diversity, non-discrimination, tolerance, fair play, solidarity, development, and peace, if we want these values to remain relevant in society, the time for change is now. What possibly could have changed in 24 months? Urging for change to now call for silencing of those who have the courage to also call for it themselves. Only those clinching to the power know for sure. For the rest of us, it would appear that the time is running out for clean athletes. And the Olympic flame, whether we're allowed to say it or not, is a little less bright today, unfortunately. To change or be changed, that is the question. The choice is really before us all and the hopes and dreams of clean athletes. And it's not just about our elite Olympic athletes of today, but it's about every kid on a playground who has a dream, an Olympic dream, who are watching and are asking themselves, what does it take for me to achieve my Olympic dream? Thank you.
Our last speaker is Richard Pound.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the chance to be here, and thank you to the two previous speakers, because it relieves me from having to do a set piece and just respond to some of the observations that have been made. For Silken, there are two things you need to know as athletes. One is that international sports federations feel pain in only one place, and that's their wallets. The second is nothing scares these old folks as much as athletes getting organized. And so don't stop doing that. I've just come from a Canadian Olympic Committee ethics session in Calgary, and one of the main issues there was to make sure that athletes get involved in every level of the sport. You may not know much about corporate finance and therefore not be able to contribute much to a discussion, but at least you'll be there so you'll know what the issues are and you learn from that. So don't give up on that. Secondly, all of this stuff about independence is quite interesting, but we have to accept it. It means it's a total failure on our part to deliver what we promise, which is clean and ethical sport. We're now up here saying, we can't do that. Imagine, you're promoting the sport and therefore you can't enforce its rules. I find that a very serious admission of failure on our part. And maybe that's the real politic of it all. We're going to have to do it, but it's a failure of what I would have thought we all stood for when we got into the sport business. As far as WADA is concerned, I think it's important to understand that it has not been weakened. It has been chronically underfinanced and underpowered, and it's taken the stakeholders, from 1999 to, in the case of the most recent code, till 2015, to actually be willing to give the organization that they've created the power to investigate. Up until 2015, we could get the benefits of investigations that had been conducted by others, but we couldn't do our own. Think about that as a difficulty that accounts for some of the frustration that exists. And WADA is, in fact, independent. It was designed precisely the way it is now to make sure that no single stakeholder would be in a position to control the organization. That's why it's a 50-50 member state and sport movement. That's why the sport movement divides itself up into IOC, IF, National Olympic Committee, and Olympic athletes. It's why the governments do have their arrangements on a continental basis. There's nobody who can, of and by itself, take over the organization. In terms of CAS, there's lots of talk about CAS, and I'm the first one to admit that there have been some bad CAS decisions. That's an element of its independence, unfortunately, and sometimes, as with ordinary courts, you get really good decisions about which you don't hear an awful lot, and you get some bad ones about which you do hear a lot. But it's absolutely essential for us in an international sport movement to have an arbitral court like CAS. If we get back to having state courts, country by country, trying to make decisions in the context of an international sports system, we're doomed. The judgments can't be enforced except in their own countries, or unless you jump through an awful lot of hoops. So the advantage of an arbitral court recognized as such, as we are, or as CAS is is that all of those awards can be enforced under the New York Convention in about 150 countries, all of the major countries in the world. And so it takes a lot of the difficulty out of applying something on an international basis. We're responding to a suggestion by the IOC that we have a separate anti-doping division of CAS to do all of the initial findings as to whether there's doping or not. I mean, it can be done. It's needlessly complex, but I think what it does point out is that at least in my view, organizations, international federations, and the IOC should be willing to enforce their own rules. It should be at the Olympic Games the IOC who decides whether there's an anti-doping rule violation. There's an appeal to CAS, but to push that down to CAS in the first place, and then have an additional appeal from a CAS set of arbitrators, and you can even have three if you think of the ad hoc divisions that exist at games. You've got an ad hoc division, you've got an anti-doping division, and then you've got regular CAS. So I think once the smoke clears with respect to Russia, we can have another look at that. On the question of doping, you can't have, as my organization does, the IOC, say the IOC has zero tolerance for doping, zero tolerance, unless maybe it's Russia. And I think we fumbled the ball pretty seriously leading up to Rio. You know, were I the president of the IOC, I would have been down on my knees saying to Richard McLaren, thank you. That's a very, very competent, thorough investigation. It demonstrates the state-supported system that everybody sort of knew was in place. And we don't have to worry so much about athlete by athlete. We're dealing with that now that we have the database. But it would have been a major lesson and a major deterrent for all other countries that might be saying, ooh, they're willing to do this to Russia. Maybe I better get my act cleaned up. I think if you look at the system that we have in place with through WADA, the system is pretty good. The science is pretty robust. As a system, you've got all of the elements that you need. What the problem is you've got a whole bunch of people out there that don't want it to work. And if we're in the business of being provocative, I'd say I would lay most of that blame at the foot of the international federations. You know, the prime directive in most international federations is not how can we advance the sport for the benefit of present and future athletes. It's how can I get reelected as president? And you don't get reelected as president if you start to try and change things. And so the result is denial, denial, denial. They think, unlike what I think our view is, that every time you catch a cheater and take him or her out of the competition, it's a small victory. And small victories lead to others. The opposite is to say, oh, well, it would be a bad reputational risk if there's any doping in the sport. It might affect sponsors, television rights, who knows what. It might affect people's perception of me as the president. And so there's a denial. And it's just a refusal to acknowledge that this is going on, not unlike what's happening with the Russians these days. And you may wonder who's giving them advice. The organization that is in a position right now to decide whether they get any cookies or not is the IOC. And why they're raining on that parade, I must say I don't understand, aside from it being about being wrong. I would say as Craig said earlier, there's nothing broken about the code. I think we can improve it. You can always improve that sort of thing. One of the changes I'd like to see is that as in most regulatory agencies in public life, the regulatory agency at least has the power to impose the initial sanction. And so when there is a problem and WADA determines that, it should be able to put in a provisional suspension. It's all appealable to CAS, but you've got to be, in this environment, you've got to be nimble. You've got to be able to act quickly and decisively and get your message out there. So let's, I think maybe it'll be more fun to have your questions and some interaction between the folks on the panel, so thank you very much.
All right, we have some time for questions. I'm going to take the first two. I'm going to ask you guys the same questions, unfair questions, admittedly, that I asked Craig Reedy. And we'll just go down the panel. So what should be done about the Winter Olympics coming up? You get to have a say in this. These other guys don't.
Yeah, I've had a lot to say about it, and I've actually had a very frank discussion with the IOC president. He said, look, I know where you're parked on this. He said, but you've got to give these investigation commissions an opportunity to do their work and report, and then we'll see. And I said, all right, I'll do my best to keep my mouth shut until we see this, but don't stuff it up.
Yeah, so listen, I along with 37 National Anti-Doping Organization and WADA Athletes Committee groups, other athlete groups, pretty clear on a consequence to the Russian Olympic Committee. Shouldn't be allowed to go to the games. Same position prior to Rio. Importantly, there should be an exception for individual athletes who can demonstrate to a consistent standard, overseen not by each IF, doesn't have the resources or the expertise to decide it, but allow individual Russian athletes to compete as neutrals in the event they can prove they weren't part of the system and weren't tainted by the drug program. To Dick's point right there, I think unfortunately we've been, suckered a little bit on waiting until these commissions. The Schmidt Commission is essentially redoing what McLaren already did. And importantly, while everybody is absolutely in favor of due process and wants the facts established, as Dick said in his speech, I think as you all who have read the McLaren report, it establishes the state, however you want to describe it, supported, directed, mandated, whether it went all the way up the chain or just to the top of the Russian minister's office, that's been established by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the IOC got rid of the Brazilian Olympic Committee on the arrest of its chairperson, Carlos Nunez. What is different between suspending the Brazilian Olympic Committee when it's in the investigative phase, hasn't even been investigated fully yet, and you've concluded an investigation that you asked WADA to start, that proves that beyond a reasonable doubt the state was involved. The Olympic Charter is a reciprocal contract. All parties to it, which includes the Russian Olympic Committee, have an obligation to ensure fair play, uphold the WADA code, and implement the WADA code in their jurisdictions. What is clear is that they failed to do that. And so far, no meaningful consequences put in place. But we've punted to another commission that we'll see ultimately what comes out, and we're obviously, believe it will continue to confirm what the truth of the McLaren report showed. But having not touched base with the key whistleblower after cases had already been, individual cases had already been closed in late August, 31st of 2017, it just doesn't give a lot of confidence, and I think it's why you see people really frustrated and upset with how this whole process has gone about.
Silke.
By the perspective of the German athletes, we think and we say that the IAAF did the right way. They focused on the federation in Russia and closed the entry for all competitions as well as for the Olympics in Rio, and I agree absolutely with Travis that the IOC should take time for itself to examine. My personal opinion is that 1 year for the Schmidt Commission is not enough to examine all the circumstances in the state-sponsored doping framework. I think as Germans we can say that we, until today, are working on our former doping system in the Eastern German state, And it's a huge history, and I'm not sure if the Russian topic is much smaller than our history. And yeah, you have to work on it, you have to deal with it, and you really have to answer many, many questions. And this is not made within 1 or 1.5 years.
Good. All right, let's open it up to your questions. Over here to the left. Do we have microphone runners? There we go.
Hello.
You succeeded.
My name's Jake Shelley. I'm a PhD student from Kingston University, and I've got a question for Travis. As Dick said, it was a great breakthrough that you now have investigative powers to conduct your own investigations. But it seems like your investigation into Alberto Salazar might have stalled because you're not able to interview who you want to interview and so forth. Is there a next step in increasing your investigative powers, or have you been frustrated in any way? What do you see as the next step in increasing your ability to catch drug cheats?
Yeah, I guess.
Could you grab the mic?
This.
Yeah.
I guess. Can I take this off? So I guess. I think. I guess first, and we can agree to disagree. You know, it's been said WADA didn't have powers to investigate prior to the code change in 2015. We don't agree with that. We think they entered agreements with Interpol, entered agreements with the World Trade Customs Organization. Article 7 of the code in 2009 required all anti-doping organizations to investigate. They were identified in the definitions as an anti-doping organization. Clearly in Article 27.2, they had compliance obligations to hold people compliant or not. And also in 27.8, they had the ability to facilitate, and the word investigations was seen. That's beyond us, but I think we have to recognize that and ask for purposes of, are we fit for the future? Are we learning from those mistakes? The code is crystal clear now that WADA has those investigatory powers. As far as USADA is concerned, we don't have necessarily any special, we're not a government organization, we're a not-for-profit corporation. We have the same powers as any private citizen would have to conduct investigations. We can sometimes go through the subpoena process with our arbitration panels where, and to your question earlier, where our success has really come from is cooperating closely with law enforcement. And one place where the independence really matters is in both the eyes of those in the field, the whistleblowers, because whistleblowers don't want to go to their sports organizations with confidential information that might ultimately be used against them. But similarly, law enforcement bodies do not share with sports organizations because they know sports organizations are going to act maybe prematurely, maybe to get in front of the news, however you want to characterize it, but there is a lot of resistance from law enforcement to give our professional leagues, for example, in the United States, any evidence that they obtain legally that could be shared if it's a discretionary policy. Now, we have some evidence, grand jury, that can't be shared, but we are frequently in a position where they easily share that with us because we're a parallel organization that's not conflicted in any way with the mission other than to fulfill the rules. And so that has led, I think, to tremendous partner sharing with law enforcement.
All right, we're going to keep questions fast and answers fast so we can get through folks. Who's next? In the back.
Thank you. Graham Steele from Eindhoven. In particular, Dick, thank you for what I think for many of us was music to our ears and your very honest summary of some of the things that have been happening and where we're at. I do want to come back to this point of independence, though, and you know, I both will remember how it was that WADA was formed with the 50% government, 50% IOC position, and remembering how the IOC viewed the outcome, how it was likely to be. That was a very good pragmatic, I think, outcome to achieve that balanced position. But I suppose any tug of war, if there's exactly the same strength on both sides, you go nowhere. And so it just seems to us now that we've moved beyond the pragmatic decision of 1999 to a position where we now need to have an organisation that is not a balance of representational points of view, but is truly an independent point of view designed solely to focus on what's good for clean sport.
Well, I mean,
I think you're okay.
It's an interesting thought, but the fact of the matter is, I was chairing it when we got it started, and you know, you have one side of the table, there are all these monolithic governments, and you know, looking with a lot of suspicion at a whole bunch of athletes and IF folks, and they're looking at these governments who've done, in their view, nothing but criticize their own efforts and so forth. And how are we going to make this work? And the answer has been surprisingly that when smart people sit around a table with a particular objective in mind, it's amazing how little disagreement there is on some of the steps that have to be taken. So I think the independence was there, and the input that we hoped to get from both sides was good. I mean, I remember when the government said, you know, let me see if I've got this straight. This cross-country skier can cancel out the vote of La France. We said, that's the way it works. So one vote per stakeholder, and it took some getting used to, but it's worked very well.
Travis, did you have some?
Yeah, and Dick, I've made no mistake, WADA has had tremendous success, and I've been around, and some others in the room prior to WADA's existence, and I think we have to acknowledge the advancements and the credit, bringing the world together, and the funding and the research. And I mean, we could go on, and at some point we should do a session on the legacy of WADA up to date. I mean, it's been absolutely fantastic. But where we are today is you have no term limits. You have necessarily term limits for the government side. You have a sport movement that consolidates its position. And if you've ever been in an executive committee meeting or a foundation board meeting, you see the sports come in with one voice. So bad that now the governments are using the term one voice, because the governments are trying to come together. But understand, the governments don't necessarily do this work, where the sports do this work, and this directly affects the sports brand. So the sports have a common interest that unites them. Without term limits, the governments do not have a common interest that unites them in their own interest, because they're competing countries against one another. So when they get to the meetings, no term limits, a rotation on the government side that is not crystal clear, where some of the largest contributors don't have seats on the executive board, and there's a movement to even have them potentially off of the foundation board, hopefully won't happen. But the bottom line, I think, Dick, is that the sports end up having the significant sway. They know the history, they know the acronyms. You put a junior minister from a European government or the US in there, and they don't know what EPO is, and they're gone a year later. So the ability to gain the expertise and the knowledge and then build the relationship to work in that political environment, unfortunately, the sports end up controlling it from what we've seen. And I think you see that translated into the decisions, particularly that have been made with respect to the investigation into WADA and the refusal, into Russia, and the refusal to broaden that investigation, even when WADA Athletes Committee, IOC Athletes Committee, USOC Athletes Committee, others were calling for the expansion of that investigation, and it simply wasn't done. And I think that's a byproduct of sport not wanting to fully investigate and come to the bottom of a really ugly situation that they had no liability in causing. And nobody's suggesting that. This was bad actors in Russia that did it, but we now have to ensure, while our history maybe has won us a gold medal at the national level, in anti-doping, athletes expect us to work just as hard to win a gold medal at the global level. And there are improvements that should be made to restore that confidence in, as the WADA Athletes and IOC Athletes Committee said by letter, that have been shattered over the last few years.
Yeah. I don't know, too many John le Carre movies here. The Olympic movement does not always act with one voice. I mean, every time we have a foundation board meeting, I get this insulting letter from somebody that purports to reflect the position of the Olympic movement. on whatever the agenda item is. That's not my position. My position is what's best for the organization, and I think there are lots of folks like that. To lay an inability for governments to focus and to pick the right representatives and who will learn the file and so on as a fault on the part of the sports system, I think is wrong. If governments are taking all this seriously, they've got to make sure that they know the file, that they send the right people to it. We had hoped when we started off that we would get ministers who are used to acting and deciding. It's very hard to get ministers to come, and ministers change, and so we've ended up with a lot of public servants, some of whom are very good, but are not in a position to do anything except take notes home and say, this is what we talked about, what do you think? But it's not it's not a monolithic control of this by the Olympic movement at all, and that's as Craig mentioned earlier. One of the things we settled on very early in WADA was that the presidency would alternate. Sport movement, public authority, sport movement. So we've done sport 1, 2. Craig is the third. The next, his successor will be chosen by governments. And there, I think there's a new onus on them to get somebody who's independent, but knowledgeable, and who can reflect a public authority perspective on whatever questions have to be decided, but you got to pick the right people.
Michelle, are you still up? There you go.
It's like a pantomime. You're behind me. Michelle Verroken, Sporting Integrity, and somebody who's worked, first of all, in a national anti-doping system, also with international federations and professional sports. I'd actually quite like not to keep hearing from Travis and Dick. I'd actually like to hear from the athletes, because it's exactly the same problem as we had back in Lausanne in 1999, where the debate and the finger pointing was going on between governments and sports federations, with the IOC joining in. So Silke, what do you think about this idea of defining everybody trying to protect clean athletes? Surely they're meant to be protecting all athletes and their systems. The systems should actually make sure they produce accountable evidence in order that we can move this debate forward. So it's about all athletes, not just a certain definition of who thinks who's clean here.
Good luck.
So she would like to hear an athlete's perspective on basically on the debate about independence, right? So where do athletes fit here?
I actually wanted to add on the debate, but I can maybe answer in that direction. I co-chair the advisory board of NATO Germany, and we restructured our NATO a few years ago, and we never have a majority of a group. Not the politics, not the sport federations, organizations, or the athletes. But what we added was people from the society. And my experience is that these people coming in to the board by heart, they know it's a difficult problem, it's a difficult goal the foundation NATO Germany has, but they come in by heart because they know they support the athletes. And as for us in Germany, we will support the NATO to foster these forces, to bring on our NATO in future with independent people who have no conflicts of interest. And this would be the right way to ensure in future the boards, I don't know, with independent people who really want to support the system, the institution, and the value of the clean sport. So for sure, we should think of if it makes really sense to have 50-50 foundation board, and if it's right that the sport has such a power, and we see that it's not good, that it's not practical to have 50% on the governmental side. So you will have always a problem. I completely would agree for a restructure of the foundation board.
Let me, we have a few minutes left. I'm going to ask the last question. And the word independent is thrown around a lot by sports organizations. It means a lot of different things, most of which are not consistent with the concept of independence. But I mean, does the sport world really want independence? And I keep coming back to this practical question that's raised by the new WADA compliance standards. I mean, would each of you be comfortable with an independent body of wise men and women who April 2nd next year say, oh, the World Cup is off because Russia is still non-compliant? I'm making that up. Who knows if they will be or won't be. But would the sports world, would the sponsors, would FIFA, would the general public accept an independent body that actually followed the letter of the law as written in such cases? Or as we've seen with Rio and with the Winter Olympics, does there have to be, as the quote Travis said from the IOC officials, some recognition that sport is entertainment? It's not purity. Is there some pragmatism here that's always going to trump these calls?
I'm here.
Well, I mean, sport is sport. We're supposed to be governing sport. It's an activity that has been defined by its participants and who accept all of the necessary rules. The extension of this ad infinitum is you get a whole bunch of people that haven't the faintest idea about sport, making all these decisions in some kind of an experiential vacuum. And so I think what we should have done was to make sure that that sport governs itself. We can kind of delegate some of that, and that's what we're in the process of doing. Okay, let's try it. I mean, nothing is forever, to see if that works better in the public mind and with athletes and so on. But make no mistake, you can't have an effective fight against doping in sport without active and enlightened participation by the public authorities. We do not have the power that we need to do everything that needs to be done for anti-doping. We don't have the power to prevent trafficking. We don't have the power to declare a substance illegal or all kind. We can't enter premises to get evidence. We need the cooperation there, and I agree with Travis to your point about the independence and so forth. We went to Interpol because they can organize investigations that we couldn't, and we would work to get information exchanged, and it tends to be one way more often than not. Same with the World Trade folks. They have the power to do these things, which we didn't. But anyway, nothing is forever here. We're looking at tweaking the code for 2019. I doubt very much that we would say to the governments, I'm sorry, you're not worth it. You can have 10% of the seats. They'd say, well, okay, how about 10% of the money and no cooperation? It would be a big risk to take.
Final short comments, because I think my time is
part of the frustration around your question is the use of the term independent. You go back to days before the Pound report in November of 2015, and the IOC saying it wants to reform the system to remove it make it independent from sports organizations. And you can see the statement that was put out that day. And I think from those in the trenches as well as from the athletes we hear, that means not just a separate organization that's funded and controlled by the same people, like we might see in the Independent Testing Authority today, but actually something where the governance doesn't have conflicting duties. So when an IOC member makes an oath, as is required under the Olympic Charter to be an IOC member, to do what's in the best interest of the Olympics, that oath, that hat that they wear continues into the drug testing arena, into the anti-doping arena, and that's what creates that conflicting position. I think truly independent, and it doesn't have to be totally separate, importantly. You can have a legislative body that sport plays a key role in, and they should play a key role because they are sports rules. But when it comes time to the executive functions, which is who's tested, what's tested for, who's prosecuted, you then have a separate judiciary. But those key functions that a sport might have an adverse interest, if suddenly the president of WADA is also the head of the Archery Federation, and we just found the biggest scandal possible in archery, and this is all a hypothetical, you can understand why the head of WADA at the time might have a conflict, because their job as the president of archery or swimming or whatever international federation is to protect the interests of that international federation and to ensure revenues continue to come into it. And then steps down.
Silke gets the last word.
Thank you. Just independence means that an organization has no involvement by a majority of a group. I think this is the main problem we have. And of course, we have, it's a question, it's a problematic question when you say your group is now small on a foundation board. But we have to deal with the problem and we have to find a solution. And I think one point of view could be to ask, of course, the sponsors with their sponsorship to give a percentage to the foundation, which is, I think, necessary. They all want to participate with their brands and being partner in the sport, but I'm not sure if they really agreed and support the anti-doping management internationally. So we also have to empower this stakeholder part to support the system.
All right, let's thank our panel.
All right.
Don't go anywhere. Stay put. The microphone.
I would also like to thank the panel warmly for traveling very far, and our moderator, Roger Pielke. The average distance to home for most of you, well, it's three of you have crossed the Atlantic to come here today. We really appreciate it. Now we are going to make a very short 3 minutes stage shift. Don't run away. Take a stretch and just wait patiently. Then we will have a debate on the 2022 World Cup in 3 minutes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. As I mentioned in my opening speech, it is a very special pleasure that we can now have a debate on one of the more controversial issues in world sport over the past 7 years, Qatar's hosting of the 2022 World Cup. Over the years, Play the Game has often been accused of being a very one-sided event, giving space to critics only. One of the challenges, and I admit that we have sometimes been a little bit one-sided, but it is very difficult to be two-sided if only one of the side is willing to engage in a debate. And we're so fortunate here today that Hassan al-Thawadi, the Secretary General of the Supreme Committee of Delivery and Legacy of the Qatar World Cup 2022, a nice long job title.
It's a very long name.
Yeah. Has accepted to come here and discuss all kinds of questions with us, to add a geopolitical perspective to the current developments in and around Qatar. We are so fortunate to have again one of our regular speakers, I can say, after the past 3 and now 4th conference, James Dorsey, whom you may already know from his blog, The Turbulent World of Mideast Soccer. A very, very renowned expert, not only in Mideast Soccer, but in well, a lot of the politics of the Middle East, and I would also say beyond. Very experienced international correspondent who will just outline what is the situation in and around Qatar right now. And then we have James Corbett, also reporter with a journalist with a very, very good track record, has visited Qatar several times, written many insightful reports on it. And the rules of the game this afternoon is that James will be the chair and also has his own short summary of the situation as he sees it. James Corbett will be the chair. James Dorsey will give a 15-minute introduction, and Hassan al-Thawadi has preferred just to speak freely and openly and informally, so it will not be a very long presentation with PowerPoints and so on. We will, given that we are delayed, we will take in total around 1 hour for the debate, so please, as always, be sharp and precise in your questions. Thank you and welcome, gentlemen. Welcome to the panel.
To be or not to be, that is the question. When Play the Game convened in the old theatre in the timeless heart of Aarhus in 2015, Hamlet's famous soliloquy were the words that Play the Game's international director Jens Sejer Andersen posed in his opening address. He was addressing very fundamental questions about the future of sport, sport integrity, and the games that we all love to play and watch. But in relation to Football's World Cup 2022, to be or not to be seems a very salient question, and has seemed so from the moment that Qatar was awarded the World Cup on the 2nd of December 2010. Almost from that very moment, the debate about Qatar has centred around if, how, why, and when the World Cup will be stripped from the country. At times, its victory has threatened to become the greatest PR disaster of all time, from being accused of being too hot and too small to host the World Cup. Discourse about its host status has encompassed a vast and sometimes bewildering array of concerns, including corruption, accusations that the country is a haven for modern slavery, that the football calendar can't cope with a tournament move to avoid the summer heat, that Qatar funds terrorism, that it has simultaneously become too powerful within world football for its own good, and yet cares nothing about the game. At times, the narrative has simply spiraled out of control. At one stage, one website gleefully made the absurd calculation that no fewer than 48,000 guest workers would lose their lives building the country's World Cup stadiums. This is without even taking into consideration the 22 men on the FIFA Exco who voted on the 2nd of December. Most are disgraced, some are dead. As a body of decision makers, they were and are totally unfit for purpose. To the world, and perhaps unfairly at times, Qatar 2022 has become a symbol of their hubris and corruption. To be or not to be, certainly a lot of football followers, egged on by media, who have treated Qatar 2022 as the summit of all wrongs in the game, would seem to have preferred the latter. However, the environment in football politics has moved on since 2015. We have a new FIFA president in Gianni Infantino, who, at least in his public pronouncements on Qatar, is far less confrontational than Sepp Blatter was. We also have an ethics chamber that has seemingly been stripped of its willingness to take on historic cases. The Garcia report has been published without the anticipated smoking gun. We also have the reality in that in less than 5 years, there is going to be a World Cup in Qatar. On Planet FIFA, there now seems to be little question about this. For me, as one of the journalists who covered the race to host the World Cups in 2018 and 2022, probably as closely as anyone else in the world, it's the grey areas that make Qatar such an intriguing story. When I first started reporting on it in mid-2009, my initial impression was of Western consultants playing on the vanity of egotistical sheikhs to earn huge consultancy fees for themselves. I remember Mohammed bin Hammam at the time seemed completely disinterested in the idea. And to an outsider, the idea seemed completely ludicrous. A World Cup in a tiny desert state? But on visiting the country later that year, I saw there was at least some coherence to their bid. Yes, the country's hot, it's small, it lacks an established mainstream football culture, but there was a willingness by the bid team to address and face up to these challenges. They asked questions no one else was willing to ask about the nature of a World Cup. Why can't a small country host it? Why can't a hot country host it? Why has the Middle East been overlooked for over a century of World Cup history? And they did offer some solutions. They also had lots and lots of money underwriting their bid. I didn't think they'd win, probably right up until the end, but I thought their outlook deserved some credit, and they offered a level of engagement that few of their rival bids matched. And then, of course, they only went and won it. Now, Hassan will probably disagree with me on this, maybe profoundly, but Qatar's win, in common with any other World Cup host victory that ever occurred under Sepp Blatter or Joe Havilland, had nothing really to do with football, the technical bid, or any of the right reasons for giving the World Cup to a nation. Exactly how and why Qatar won, like Russia, may never fully be known. But what has come out over the past 7 years, whether it's in terms of whistleblower testimony, the leaked files from the AFC audit, some of which were selectively leaked to the Sunday Times, the work of many investigative journalists, Michael Garcia's interesting but ultimately flawed report into the bid process, it showed just how brilliantly, not necessarily the Qatar bid, but the Qatari sports establishment played the bid game. Over the past 7 years, there's been a succession of challenges to the Qatar World Cup that transcends the question of why it was awarded the finals in the first place. Some, such as the moves to strengthen migrant workers' rights, have stemmed directly from the scrutiny that the World Cup has placed on the country and conformed to the FIFA narrative that football can actually change the world. Others, such as the heat question, have been given imperfect solutions, such as the Winter World Cup switch. Others, such as how a tiny nation will manage the influx of so many visitors, we may not know until 2022. To be or not to be, that was the question that reared its head again over the summer. This time it wasn't just about the World Cup, but the very future of Qatar. In June, several countries, including all of Qatar's neighbours, abruptly cut off diplomatic relations and imposed trade and travel bans. The crisis was an escalation of the Qatar-Saudi proxy conflict, or the Arab Cold War, as some people call it, and its origins lie in the profound differences over Qatar's response to the Arab Spring, among various other reasons. For a moment during the summer, it didn't seem impossible that tanks could roll over Qatar's borders in the way that Iraqi tanks had crossed Kuwait 27 years earlier. Could the fact that they didn't be down to the prominence the World Cup had suddenly given Qatar? Could the World Cup have been said to have saved the country? Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps I exaggerate the importance of football. Certainly, the Qatar bid's original dream for a World Cup for the entire Middle East seems to be over for as long as it is shunned by most of its neighbours. Addressing these questions today, and many others, is the distinguished journalist and scholar James Dorsey, whose Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer blog is essential reading. He'll give an outline now of the geopolitical perspectives and current challenges facing Qatar and the Gulf region. We'll follow this with a short Q&A question before Hassan Al-Thawadi, Secretary General of the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, gives his own perspectives. I'll then conduct a Q&A session, which we will then open to the floor. But first I hand to James Dorsey.
Jens, James, thank you for the very gracious words. The question that I was asked to answer is whether Qatar, the World Cup, can overcome the current diplomatic and economic crisis in the Gulf. And the short answer is the crisis in the Gulf is Qatar's least problem when it comes to the World Cup in 2022. Beyond the fact that efforts by Gulf states, first and foremost among which the United Arab Emirates, have sought to discredit Qatar as a host long before the UAE and Saudi Arabia in June declared their diplomatic and economic boycott, Qatar has proven capable of addressing potential disruptions. The import of construction materials may have become more expensive, and they may have to travel a longer route, but that does not impair the Gulf states' ability to complete infrastructure on time. In some ways, if the Gulf crisis were to last another 5 years until the World Cup, attendance may prove to be a more important issue. Not because Qatar would still be involved in a dispute with its neighbours. The crisis has already become the new normal. And even if it were resolved today, the region in terms of relationships will never return to the status quo ante. The reason why attendance may be an issue is that the demography of fans attending the World Cup in Qatar may very well be a different one than at past tournaments. Qatar is likely to attract a far greater number of fans from the region, as well as from Africa and Asia. Governments in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain, if they were still maintaining their travel bans, may find themselves in a very difficult position if they were depriving their nationals from attending the first ever World Cup, not only in the region, not only in the Arab world, but in the Gulf. How those governments would handle that would have consequences for the nature of the boycott, given that not only have they banned travel, they've also closed sea and air links. The Asian Football Confederation's competition committee last week urged governments to exempt football teams from travel bans. The call was in response to the travel ban Saudi Arabia announced last year following the rupture in relations with Iran, as well as the more recent bans on travel to Qatar. The question is why that advice should not also be applicable to fans. Equally immediate and significant is the fact that particularly the UAE is not going to give up its covert efforts to get Qatar deprived of the World Cup. Qatar is vulnerable in that battle, not because the UAE is so powerful, but because of at least one of the two main issues that were at the core of the controversy about its hosting rights, the integrity of Qatar's bid. That integrity remains in question, with the legal proceedings in New York and Zurich, irrespective of the fact that Qatar has categorically and repeatedly denied any wrongdoing. The legal proceedings, while disturbing, are likely to drag on for a considerable period of time, and as such may not pose an immediate threat. What is more immediate is the reputational damage Qatar has suffered. To be sure, the Gulf crisis has enhanced Qatar's reputation to some degree. After all, the perceptions of the Gulf crisis are one of David versus Goliath, Qatar as the resilient underdog defending its independence, and right as a small state to chart its own course. Qatar deserves credit for reforms being introduced to its controversial kafala or labor sponsorship system that are likely or possibly will become a model for the region. In doing so, it cemented the 2022 World Cup as one of the few mega events with a real potential of leaving a legacy of change. Qatar started laying those foundations for that change by early on becoming the first and only Gulf state to engage with its critics, international human rights groups, and trade unions. The problem is that by the time that engagement produced real results, the reputational damage had been done. And as we all know, reputations are easy to tarnish and difficult to polish. There is little doubt in my mind that the World Cup more recently was not the only driver in labor reform. So was the International Labour Organization, the ILO, that was about to censor Qatar, and the Gulf crisis itself. There is no doubt that Qatar has learned from mistakes it made in public diplomacy and public relations aspects of the labor issue. That is evident in Qatar's markedly different handling of the Gulf crisis. It's a far cry from the ostrich that puts its head in the sand, hoping that the storm will pass, only to find out that by the time it rears its head, the wound has festered and it has lost its strategic advantage. That leaves Qatar with the issue of the integrity of its bid, which may be, in terms of public diplomacy, the toughest nut to crack. On the principle of where there is smoke, there is fire, Qatar is in a bind. Nonetheless, some greater degree of transparency would have been helpful. The integrity issue, Qatar's weak point, is without doubt going to be exploited by its detractors, first and foremost in the Gulf. For critics of Qatar, there are two questions. One is, who do they want to get in bed with? Qatar's detractors, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, hardly have stellar human and labor rights records. If anything, Their records are worse than that of Qatar, which admittedly does not glow. It is doubtful that the World Cup is at the core of the Gulf crisis, despite a declaration by Dubai's top security official, Lieutenant General Khalfan, that the crisis would be resolved if Qatar surrendered its hosting rights. Nonetheless, it is an important enough symbol and vehicle for reputational capital for Qatar's detractors, and particularly the UAE, to target. That is evident from the emails of the UAE ambassador in Washington, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, whose account was either hacked or leaked by an insider. Al-Otaiba, I'm sorry, I'm going, just bear with me 1 second. Al-Otaiba devised a complex financial maneuver to undermine Qatar's currency and deprive the Gulf state of its hosting rights. While Qatar sought to counter the UAE efforts, it's noticeable that it has not adopted a similar tactic, for example, targeting the 2020 World Expo in Dubai. The second question critics have to ask themselves is how best to leverage the World Cup, irrespective of whether the Qatari bid was compromised or not. On the assumption that it may have been compromised, the question is less how to extract retribution for wrongdoing that was common practice in global football governance. Leveraging should focus on how to achieve a fundamental reform of global sports governance that has yet to emerge 6 years into a crisis that was in part sparked by the Qatar World Cup. It will go too far to go into this in great detail, but has to do with, among other things, the fact that untouched in the governance crisis is the corrupting, ungoverned, and incestuous relationship between sports and politics. The future of the Qatar World Cup and the Gulf crisis speaks to the pervasiveness of politics in sports. The World Cup is political by definition. Retaining Qatar's hosting rights or depriving the Gulf state of the right to host the tournament is ultimately a choice with political consequences. As long as the crisis continues, retaining rights is a testimony to Qatar's resilience. Deprival would be a victory for its detractors. It is with good reason that the UAE will no doubt continue its covert campaign to undermine Qatar's hosting rights. The real yardstick in the debate about the Qatari World Cup should be how the sport and the integrity of the sport benefits most. And even then, politics is never far from what the outcome of that debate is. Obviously, instinctively, the optics of no retribution raises the question of how that benefits integrity. Yet it strikes me that the potential legacy of social and economic change that is already evident with the Qatar World Cup is more important than the feel-good effect of having done the right thing with retribution, or the notion of setting an example. Add to that is the fact that in current circumstances, a withdrawal of hosting rights would likely be interpreted as a victory of one side over the other, further divide the Arab and Muslim world, and enhance a sense among many Muslims of being on the defensive and under attack. And let's be clear, the rot in sports governance goes far beyond financial and performance corruption. That is evident in the way the Gulf crisis, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict increasingly permeate soccer, with a mounting number of decisions that upend the notion of a separation of politics and sports. They also put an end to the principle of judging professionals on their merits rather than nationality, and make a mockery of the ideal of soccer as a bridge builder rather than a divider. In a bizarre and contradictory sequence of events, FIFA President Gianni Infantino in June rejected involving the group in the Gulf crisis by saying that the essential role of FIFA, as I understand it, is to deal with football and not to interfere in geopolitics. Yet, on the same day, that he made his statement, Infantino waded into the Gulf crisis by removing a Qatari referee from a 2018 World Cup qualifier at the request of the UAE. FIFA, beyond declaring that the decision was taken in view of the current geopolitical situation, appeared to be saying, by implication, that a Qatari, by definition of his nationality, could not be an honest arbiter of a soccer match involving one of his country's detractors. In FIFA's decision, politics trumped professionalism. No pun intended. A demand this month by the Egyptian Football Federation to disbar a Qatari from refereeing Egyptian and Saudi matches during next year's World Cup in Russia puts FIFA in a position in which it will have to decide to either opt for professionalism over politics or also disbar from refereeing politically sensitive matches by game officials from Qatar's detractors, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain, who have likewise been appointed for the tournament. FIFA's tying itself up in knots in response to the Gulf crisis, like the politics underlying corruption charges in New York and Zurich, cries out for putting the inextricable relationship between sports and politics on the table and developing ways to govern a relationship that is a fact of life. It is a relationship that sports executives, politicians, and government officials deny, even though it is public, recognizable, and undeniable. If the Qatar World Cup, because of the controversy that surrounds it, and because of its World Cup, have become a geopolitical football, and if that leads ultimately to an honest and open debate about the relationship of politics and sports, Qatar unwittingly, rather than wittingly, would have made a fundamental contribution to a healthier governance of sports in general, and soccer in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Hassan would like to say a few opening words, and then we'll start a question and answer session.
So I was told to make sure that I can be heard. So can everybody hear me? Yes?
No.
No? So I guess I need to use.
Do you want to use the
look at technical support. Hello? All right, then I'll get rid of the mic in a second. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Hassan Thawadi, and I'd urge you to forget the title. It's a very long title out of necessity more than a feeling of grandeur. But simply put, I was in charge of the bid during 2009-2010, and I'm in charge now of delivering the World Cup. And I'm sure one way or the other, I've come across your desktops, your tablets, or whatever else it may be. I'm in charge of the Qatar 2022 World Cup, which I think it's very safe to say caused a lot of controversy with a lot of people. And I'm assuming most of the people in this room are not the fans, not the biggest of fans of my World Cup. What I'd like to say simply, and then I'd actually really want to engage with you in a Q&A session. When we bid to host the World Cup, we actually bid with, well, to start off with, we were members coming from different parts of the walks of life, not involved in football. As a matter of fact, the entire bid team was not involved in the world of football directly, except for me, who I was giving some legal advice to a football club in Qatar. That was the extent of my involvement and some advice and support to the Qatar Football Association. Aside from that, we were literally, some people were bankers, some people were engineers, some people were supporting some educational initiatives, and we all kind of got together. We were a group of misfits, if you will. And we entered into the race believing in the ideals of sports and the ideals of the World Cup. We were fans. We were football fans, professionals, passionate, engaged, and we started the journey. We had a lot of obstacles. The first one was people did not know where Qatar was and who we were and why we were bidding. Others who knew didn't really realize that we had a football pedigree, or at least a football history. And we had to overcome a lot of challenges. And we can always debate the merits of the bid or not, but I think one thing we can agree upon is that we were in every single event, we were passionate, and we were engaged. Every presentation we provided was top-notch, if I say so myself. We addressed whatever obstacles that were presented in front of us, and we addressed them in a way where we created advantages out of these obstacles. And it led to our win. And as I said, not a lot of people were very happy with that win. A lot of people that didn't follow the bid were not happy. A lot of people that did not follow our journey or who knew who we were very surprised. And they raised questions that we'd answered, but unfortunately didn't reach them. Since then, we've started the journey of delivering the World Cup and delivering on our promises. The last 7 years were not easy, and not easy for many different reasons, whether because of the criticism that we faced, whether because of geopolitical tensions that were at sometimes clandestine and covered up, and people were attacking us from behind curtains, and other times because of actual challenges that we faced on the ground. But throughout the journey, the promises that we made during the bid, the commitments that we made during the bid, the value that we saw out of this World Cup, we delivered on them. We continued on the path of delivering them. We continued on the path of making good that this World Cup was a catalyst for positive change. We can always disagree on the extent of change, but there was change that was occurring on the ground. There were achievements being made on the ground. The last of which, we can talk about worker welfare reforms. I say it from the very beginning, we had issues, like any country in the world. I don't think any country in the world today can claim that did not have issues on worker welfare. But we had issues, yes we did. And we recognized these issues before we bid for the World Cup. My country launched the Qatar National Vision 2030 in 2008, and the purpose of that was the aims and the vision of what we wanted to achieve by 2030. There were 4 pillars: human development, economic diversification, environmental sustainability, and social development. Under social development, there was a commitment about improving the worker welfare situation in the country. This was before we even bid. It was launched in 2008. It was a long journey. We're not ended, the journey hasn't ended. But just recently, the ILO, and more importantly, one of the most ardent critics of my country, of Qatar and worker welfare standards, ITUC and Sharon Burrow, recognized that progress is being made and commitment is being made. Again, this is not the end of the journey, but progress has been made. When we're looking at infrastructure, one of the things that a lot of people were very surprised about or very cynical about when we won the right to host the World Cup was, how can you deliver this World Cup? You're a small country, you do not have the infrastructure available, it's not possible. But yes, we were selling a potential, we were selling a vision, we were selling the possibility of being able to achieve infrastructure of highest quality, stadiums of the highest quality, and be able to deliver a World Cup like no other, the compact World Cup. And today, 7 years on, we finished one of our stadiums, the first stadium, 5.5 years before the World Cup, state-of-the-art stadium, utilizing state-of-the-art cooling technology that not a lot of people are aware of, but it is actually, well, James, you've experienced the cooling technology, and this was the earlier version.
Yeah, it was too cold.
It was too cold. Literally, you had to wear a sweater, if I'm not mistaken. This was early on. This was in 2010, was it? Early 2010. Since then, 7 years on, our cooling technology is 60% more efficient in terms of cooling, 40% more sustainable. I won't get into the details of it because as we sit down and talk, I'll be able to explain more and engage with you more on your specific questions. Needless to say, what I wanted to send the message about was we made commitments and we made promises that a lot of people thought were just that. They were simple, empty promises. That we will not deliver on this. That we will not work on delivering this, the lofty promises that we made. Or that we were too idealistic in what we viewed. And that couldn't be further from the truth. On the infrastructure side, on whatever cynics had, on whatever, I won't say detractors, but people with, I'm going to say it, lack of imagination, today we're delivering on the unimaginable that was there in 2010. It is being delivered today. When we come about social movements, when we talk about worker welfare, yes, we are delivering and we are making progress, significant strides. Again, the journey is not ended, but progress is being made and commitment is being made, gradually and slowly, and the journey will not end in 2022. It will continue. When we talk about a World Cup to bring people together, now here, this is the biggest statement that we've made and the biggest one and the biggest promise that we made, or not the promise, but the dream that we're trying to sell. And this is the one that most people in the world look at us with a lot of cynicism because, yes, we are too idealistic in this. But guess what? you need to think about something as lofty as that. You need to try to achieve something as big as that. Because there are far too many cynics in this world. There are far too many cynics in this world. It's easy to criticize. It's easy to sit down and make a claim that you cannot achieve human interaction through sports. As a matter of fact, it differentiates more than brings people together. It is so easy to criticize. It is so easy to sit down and poke holes in these dreams. But where does that get us? Where do we end up? We end up in a world where it's easy to create conflict, where conflict is the norm, where it's easy to sit down and throw rocks at anybody and just sit down and claim a holier-than-thou approach, rather than actually trying to achieve and trying to change the reality. And that's what we're trying to do with this World Cup. We've launched initiatives and we've seen human interaction and we've seen human emotions coming out as a result of this World Cup that inspire us to continue day in, day out. We've launched one of our programs, which is called Jasur Institute. Jasur Institute, effectively it's a center of excellence. We've partnered up with Georgetown University, Leeds University, and Liverpool University. We've also partnered up with Everton, who've been a very big supporter of Jasur Institute. We've partnered up with Wasserman and a number of international companies and organizations. And the main aim of Jasur was to develop the sporting capabilities of the people in the Middle East in the sporting industry. And it had two main aims or main goals. The first was to develop the capabilities and create a database of people in the Middle East that can help us host the World Cup. So it would be the Middle East and the Arab world welcoming the world in Qatar in 2022. But the second one was to pick up the sporting industry, develop people's capabilities, empower them to contribute further and lift up our sporting industry so that it becomes a genuine industry contributing to our economy and the stability of our region, creating jobs, creating actual productive jobs as opposed to jobs being provided by governments just for the sake of addressing the unemployment issue, but actual creative, actually productive jobs within the region. And it's been a great success. It was launched in around 2013. We've had over 2,000 people from all over the Middle East coming and participating. And one of the stories that for me is a great example of the value that Jasur has to offer is a young gentleman from Yemen, Badr al-Baram, who literally every time he would come to his courses would have to traverse a war-torn country every time to come to Qatar, sometimes sleeping in his car in a very, very viciously conflicted area, just to come to Qatar, just to benefit out of Jasur, just because he could see the value that Jasur can contribute to him, to his future, to his progress. And that has a knock-on effect. It's a small thing. For a lot of people, you might see it as being a very unimportant sideline story. But it's these small little building blocks that you build upon to create a long-term sustainable change within our region. And it's something that our region desperately needs. We've launched another initiative called Generation Amazing that uses football for development. Generation Amazing is an initiative effectively utilizes football in developing communication skills and leadership skills, amongst other skills, for people within rural areas. And we've launched it in Pakistan, we've launched it in Nepal, we've launched it in some of the refugee camps in Jordan, and we're looking to expand this as wide as possible as well. And of course, one of our ambassadors is Xavi Hernandez, who's a great ambassador. And even in Qatar, we've actually launched this initiative, which is called Generation Inclusive, and looks at being as inclusive as possible of people within different walks of society into Generation Amazing, and utilizing football to integrate people within different walks of life in Qatari society. And again, the stories that we've heard and the success stories that come out of it inspire us day by day to move forward, regardless of whatever obstacles we find, regardless of whatever criticisms we face, regardless of whatever punches in the guts we always get on a daily basis, because we see the power of this World Cup. This World Cup is not 28 days of football. This World Cup is not a stadium that is state-of-the-art. This World Cup is people. This World Cup is the future for our people. It's a future for our region. And yes, we have challenges, and while the blockading nations, unfortunately, as of yet, are another obstacle, another challenge, I'd just like to point out that it's 4 countries, 3 of them in the GCC. The remaining countries in the GCC, in particular Kuwait and Oman, are 100% behind the World Cup. The rest of the Arab world and the rest of the Arab people are behind the World Cup, through and through. And this is why I am very optimistic that this World Cup will serve as a platform. One, to heal our own wounds in the region. But two, to be able to be a platform to bring the average individual, not the sports stars, not the sports officials, not the elite, but the average sports fan, the average football fan, to bring them in connection and in contact together. The people in the Middle East to be able to interact with people from Germany, from Holland, from Denmark, from everywhere. To be able to actually realize that we have differences, but we can actually celebrate the differences together, but we all share the same common humanity. It's a lofty dream, I know, and people can still turn around look at me and say, you're dreaming and it'll never happen. But I'll just take you back to two things. One, in 2009 when we first started, everybody said we can never win, and everybody thought it was ridiculous. Now we can get into the reasons we won, but we were able to achieve that dream. We were able to deliver a great World Cup. And I'll go to a bit more of a historical example. If you go back to 1960 and claim that your phone can be strong, it can be much more powerful than the most advanced computer of the time, and you'd be able to communicate with people via video across the globe, people in the 1960s would have thought you'd be ridiculous. People in the 1960s would have thought you would be dreaming. And yet today, nothing is impossible. I'm dreaming, yes, I am a dreamer, don't get me wrong. I am absolutely 100% a dreamer. I believe in the power of this game. I believe in the power of football. I believe in the power of the World Cup. That's what got me going through it on a daily basis. That's what got me through a 40-minute shower to actually go and face the world every day during a certain period of my life. But I'm also a realist. I'm also realistic. I'm not saying everything is going to be resolved by this World Cup and we're going to find all the solutions. But I do believe that there's a great transformative power that it has, or at least it can start the engine and start the process and start the discussion towards a transformative power. And I think every one of you here is not a cynic. I don't think you guys are cynics. I think people in this room, the reason you're here today is because you believe in the transformative power of football and sports. Because people who get together and believe in the same thing and push the movement in the right direction can create change. And that's exactly where I'm at with you. I'm exactly on the same path. Except I think about my World Cup, and I hope that by the end of the day, I can convince some of you about the merits of my World Cup. And now with that, I said I'm not going to speak too long, but I realize I always talk too much. So I'm going to shut up and pass it on for the Q&A sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you. Okay, I did have a list of my own questions, but I'm going to open it straight to the floor because we're pushed for time. So if you could keep the questions as brief as possible, and Hassan will keep the answers as long as possible. Lady at the front. Do we have a roving mic? It's coming behind you.
Thank you very much. I'm Minky Worden from Human Rights Watch. I appreciate your coming to share your dream, your vision for the World Cup in 2022. I also, as we have discussed, wanted to mention that the migrant workers who are building the stadiums, $500 million a week of infrastructure that is entirely new, those workers, every one of them comes to Qatar because they have a dream. And their dream is to earn a living wage in conditions of safety. On your sites, on the Supreme Committee sites, we know that you've made important reforms. Human Rights Watch has said so. However, those reforms stop at the stadium door. And it's very important that the infrastructure that is being constructed, included with the World Cup reforms, are the high-speed railway, the highway, the hotels that fans will stay in. And since the temperatures caused the World Cup to be moved from the summer to the winter to protect fans and players, don't you think those same protections that workers, migrant workers from all over the world who are going to help you realize your vision don't you think they deserve the same protections that football players and fans will enjoy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minky. As you, well, just to address that point plain and simply, yes, I think everybody deserves that protection. When it comes to the issue of heat, of course, we've had extensive discussions, and I think we've demonstrated to Human Rights Watch, amongst many others, but we've had that specific discussion on the heat index, and of course, us utilizing the Humidex heat index, which from our side, what the Humidex does, just to explain to those that may not be aware, it effectively measures the impact of heat and humidity, and ensuring that, for us, it's an automated system, so that at a point in time when it reaches a certain degree that we've deemed is unsafe, a siren rings out and all work stops until the temperatures come back to acceptable norms. So that's generally how we've utilized it, and we've introduced it within the Supreme Committee projects. All our projects now are using it, or will be very shortly using it throughout the entire sites. But I do agree, there should be an assessment on the summer areas, and there has been discussions on looking at that, and I think overall, the progress that's been made and the recognition of the progress that's been made in the state of Qatar, generally speaking, on worker welfare reforms, especially, as I said, just recently with the ILO decision and the comments that came from ITUC, I think entails or is an indication of the fact that we will be looking at addressing this issue, no doubts. At least from the Supreme Committee side, we'll definitely be looking at it. We've had the discussions. We've taken on board also Human Rights Watch's comments. And I've given my commitment that we will be looking into this and addressing it. I've actually introduced one of the educational institutions in Qatar to draft something around it, to look at a research paper in relation to that matter, to put in a policy decision on that. And that will be hopefully coming up shortly. So we'll definitely be sharing it with you soon.
Okay, next question. Gentleman at the back. Could you say who you are and where you're from, please, as well?
Hello, my name is Jeppe. I'm from the Danish newspaper Politiken. Mr. Thawadi, we have seen the news stories from Sunday Times based on leaked documents. We've heard the whistleblowers talking about corruption. We've seen Mohammed bin Hammam being suspended because of corruption. What are your comments on that, and also why on earth should we believe that you did not buy the World Cup?
Wow, that's a pretty
Can I add a follow-up question? Have you ever played the Ugly Game, and what's your thoughts on it?
Well, let's start off with that question. The Ugly Game. Have you read The Ugly Game? Have you had a chance to read The Ugly Game? Well, yes. Sorry, the person who asked the question, the gentleman asked the question. Have you read it? The Ugly Game.
Jonathan Calvert's book on the Qatar.
The book, yeah. Oh, you've read the book? Okay, fair enough. I just wanted to know first, about that before I comment on the book. Well, apparently, I think, if I'm not mistaken, to start off with, the book described me as tall, right? I don't think I'm tall. Whip-smart and bug-eyed. Fair enough. I'll leave that comment till later. Look, my answer to that is simple. The Sunday Times expose, we've answered every question that's been presented. We've refuted every claim that was presented. The issue of the whistleblower, I'm assuming you've read the Michael Garcia report, right? You've read it intensely. And I think in there, it indicates the credibility and the claims that were presented against us via the whistleblower. I think it's important to note, first and foremost, when the Sunday Times story first came out, it came out via parliamentary privilege through a session, because there wasn't anything in there that was able to being utilized. I won't get into much of the details other than saying, why should you believe us? We were investigated. We were investigated by Michael Garcia. If you've read the Garcia report indicated the amount of cooperation and transparency that we approached that investigation. Yes, in the beginning of the Garcia report, they did state that they were limited in their authority for demanding documents and demanding information. On the other hand, we treated Michael Garcia as if he had that authority, and therefore we shared any information that they requested and provided any information that we requested. At the end of the report, The Garcia report clearly stated that either there was no truth to the claims presented against us, or simply put, that it was false. And there's no evidence to support any claims made against us. We've been open. We've been transparent in our journey. We've been transparent in the work that we've done. We've been open to engage with everybody that is here. We've been open to engage with any cynics and any critics, including Jonathan Calvert, who I have to say, honestly, I'm not going to lie to you, I was hoping that he would be here amongst the audience, because I was hoping to sit down and engage with him, especially with that very exciting book that they issued, and actually have a conversation with him on how he'd think, how ridiculous we would be if we were really following him in a Lamborghini late at night. If you've read the book, you'll understand the reference. We're here. We've never hidden. Any questions that you had, we'd answer, and we provided. Our engagement was open. Any question that was presented to us, we responded to. With Michael Garcia, we opened our books. We opened everything that we had. Because we wanted to be vindicated. And the report, in the end, vindicates us. If you read the report, at the end, it vindicates us and clearly showcases that there might be areas that might not be clear, but in the end, there's no evidence and there's no truth to a lot of the allegations that were presented to us or presented against us. Why should you believe us? In my opinion, because we're saying the truth. But the question is, what do you need for you to believe? I don't know. All I can say is, here I am. Ask your questions, what I can answer, I will do my best to answer you.
But at the same time, Hassan, do you not appreciate that given what we know about the FIFA Executive Committee who actually voted on that day, people are always going to have questions? And
yes.
What we know about other host victory wins.
I don't deny that. Yes, unfortunately, again, our World Cup was born into fire and baptized by fire, and it continues to be so. Yes, I do recognize that other members of the Executive Committee are being held for other reasons, not in relation to 2022 or 2018, for other issues. I do admit that, yes, and that taints our win. It does taint our win. But I'll ask you a very simple question before we move on to that. Had England won, would any of you in this room be sitting down right now and questioning England's win? You would? You would question the win, and you would undergo this entire process? I don't think so. You might say, yes, I disagree. And you know why I disagree? Do you know why I disagree? Because not one of you has actually raised with any serious issues, the issues of Australia, the issues of England, the impropriety issues that have been raised. Maybe some of you individually might have, but collectively, none of you have. Collectively, I disagree with you. I respectfully disagree. The U.S., the actions that U.S., the relationship that the U.S. had, the very extensive relationship that was undergone, not a lot of people raised that. Not a lot of people raised that question. Australia, and you're talking about questions of human rights. There was an issue that was raised in relation to Australia. Not a single person raised any issue about human rights in relation to Australia. Not a single person came out and said, none of these bids deserve to win because of these issues. A lot of the critics and a lot of the cynics came out, and a lot of English newspapers who described my country in the most ugliest of terms, and yet came out and actively said, Australia should have won, England should have won, the US should have won, the US is ready to host the World Cup. Where did anybody come out and say, you know what, disband the whole thing? If you truly believed, if you were going to question England, where were the people coming out and saying disband the whole thing?
Well, lots of people have come out and said, let's disband FIFA.
Yes, after Qatar won, but before that, nobody said it. Before that, everybody was behind the bids. People were rallying behind the bids, more or less. You know that, James. Before that, people were rallying behind the bids. Not a lot of people came out and said, this whole system is flawed, get rid of the bid before the win happened. Before Qatargate, if we describe it, happened. None of the people came out. I was following the news very closely. Did anybody raise that issue? Needless to say, all I'm going to say is, simply put, we were new people. We were newcomers. Everybody else in the different bids, they were the old school. We were newcomers. Every single one of us was a new, young team coming on board, promoting the bid, and you saw the work that we did, right? You saw the amount of passion and the amount of effort that we put in.
This is one of the things that I can't square, though, Hassan, because at the one time you have this youthful and optimistic view of the world, and
yes,
lots of interesting technological ideas and a debate about the nature of the World Cup. On the other hand, you have someone who's old and conservative and rotten to the core, like Julio Grondona, who voted for Qatar, and I can't for the life of me understand why he might have done that, why he wouldn't have voted for an established power.
For me, honestly, and I know I'm going to say this and I'm going to get a lot of smirks from people, but honestly, because we were able to sit down and communicate with Grondona. Not a lot of bids had the ability to sit down and communicate with them. I actually had a good relationship with Grondona. I had a great relationship with Grondona. And we were likable people. You saw us. We were people that actually built a very strong personal connection. I'm not going to say that that was all it was. I think the fact, the potential that the Qatar World Cup offered as well, whether it was for football development or potentially for raising the brand of football at the time, I think that might have been a big element into it. But do not underestimate the personal connections that you build, especially, as you said, with people that were old school. The ability just to sit down and communicate with Grondona in Spanish goes a long, long way. It goes a long, long way. Being able to crack a joke with him in Spanish and be able to communicate, in my opinion, goes a long way, just like being able to communicate with other people in French. And our bid had that ability. We had that ability to communicate people in French, in Spanish, in English, in Arabic, in many different languages. We were there. We immersed ourselves within people's ability, and we were able to sell that big dream, that big vision of what this World Cup was. As I said, for the cynics, it might not seem capable, it might not seem doable, but we did it.
Do you have any comment about the recent allegations that were made in the Brooklyn court about Grondona?
In which one in particular? The accusation that or the claims?
The claims that he was after $1 million.
My comments are the following. The first, I think, if anybody's read this transcript, clearly said when they asked him specifically if he's got any evidence, he has no evidence. I think that goes a long way towards that. The second thing is, simply put, I don't know what he's talking about.
Okay, fine. Next question. Paul at the back.
Hi, I'm Paul Ødegaard from the Josimar magazine. The bid leader of the bid inspection team, Harold May Nichols,
yes,
he assessed Qatar as the least capable among all the bids presented. Later, he was banned from the FIFA Ethics Committee for asking for favors from the Aspire Academy while he did the inspection in Qatar. In the Garcia report, it was revealed, when the full was published by FIFA, it was revealed that the leader of the Aspire Academy reported to the leadership in Qatar, who then notified FIFA. Was this a setup, and did you deliberately do that because Harold May Nichols didn't rank your bid higher, and that he later criticized or made comments that he had worries about arranging the World Cup in the summer?
Sorry, just to clarify to the audience, Harold May Nichols was the former head of the Chilean FA, and he was in charge of the FIFA inspection committees. They inspected Qatar, I think, in September 2010. And he was critical, but I don't know that it was a damning verdict. He said there were logistical challenges and marked Qatar down in some of the categories. The reports, I felt as an assessor of the bid process, didn't really give any weight to one or other candidates, but that's my own subjective opinion. I'll pass to Hassan.
No, thank you, James. Well, the question, I guess you're asking, did we set up or vindictively try to take revenge on Harold May Nichols? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that is my direct question, if you did it to remove a critical voice.
No. Well, to start off with, he already sent the report, so the report was already out there. And simply put, no, we're not that vindictive and we're not that evil. I can assure you, no. That wasn't the case. And I'd like to just point out one thing about the report. For a lot of people, they see the report as damning, as destructive, and as a death nail, which meant we should not have won, and one of the reasons why we shouldn't have won. But I think if a lot of you have read the report, and any of you have gone through the report, in the end of the report, it highlights the risks, the level of risks in the report, whether it's medium risk, low risk, high risk. We only got one category of high risk. The majority was either medium risk or low risk. So in the end, the report was not that damning. Even in the issue where people say, was why Qatar should not win, which is the medical issue about the heat, even in that, it actually highlighted and stated that heat poses as a risk, however, unless mitigating actions are not taken, such as brakes or whatever it is, or cooling breezes and so on. Obviously, we had our cooling technology, which at the time was considered in its prototype stage, so people did not really see the efficiency and the efficacy of it, which today it's out there for everybody to see and experience. But the report was not that damning for us. If you look at it on the face of it and you read deeper into it, you'll see, I mean, it wasn't the best of reports, but it definitely was not one that would stop us or should prohibit us from hosting a major event.
Sorry. Sorry, which question?
No, that's it.
Chris.
Hi, Christopher Gaffney, Independent Scholar. I have a question for both of you. One is, I think we need to remember that you played the game as it was being played, and we know that the game itself is deeply flawed, but you played a flawed game and you won the World Cup under those circumstances. So I think I'm not going to talk about the bid anymore. And one thing that you keep referring to, or you referred to, is how this World Cup will be a chance for the world to get together. But the world does this all the time anyway. Why, in particular, and this is for James Dorsey as well, the Qatari World Cup is going to be a very specific World Cup in one of the world's wealthiest nations for the world's wealthiest people to go and watch a spectacle of sport in stadiums that will be constructed under adverse conditions, as Minky and her group has pointed out, on infrastructure and political conditions that are fraught with a million kinds of problems in a way that we haven't seen until perhaps next year's Russian World Cup. In this regard, how is it that the Qatari World Cup is a necessary event? What actual things will bring it from being your World Cup, your personal World Cup, and a Qatari political project, to being a World Cup that is ours, that reflects football culture as it is, or as we would like it to be? And I'd like to know how exactly this first World Cup in the Middle East will reflect this universal value when it is going to be for the global elite that can fly in for a week of holiday.
All right. Well, let's start off by okay. So how's this World Cup going to be your World Cup and the world's World Cup? Let me start off by saying this. From the day we bid, we believed in that transformative power of this World Cup. It was a bigger thing. It wasn't just a 28-day tournament. And we realized when we say that, we mean that it's going to touch base on many different elements and many different levels. To truly make it a regional World Cup, more importantly, first and foremost, I will be very honest with you, first and foremost, it is a Middle Eastern Arab World Cup. That was our aim. Our aim was for it to be an engine to create development, to push forward progress, to create reforms within our region for the people of our region. And in using it as a platform to bring people together, it's by fans coming in and participating and looking and understanding at the football culture that we have in the region for them to be able to integrate on a football level. That was the vision that we had. And we embarked on that journey, on delivering it. So let me take it step by step. Let's take the first step, which is stadiums being built in adverse conditions and so on and so forth. The World Cup shed a light on worker welfare reforms. The commitment was there, as I said from before, but progress was, to a certain extent, stalling. Reform was, to a certain extent, stalling, or at least enforcement of the reform was stalling. You cannot deny that the World Cup, with the spotlight that it shed, accelerated significantly the progress that was being made. The Supreme Committee's work served as a benchmark, a flawed benchmark, because no benchmark in the world is sufficient. But we nevertheless always work to engage with NGOs, engage with the outside world, engage with our critics to be able to improve the condition for workers gradually, in a very complex issue. And it is a complex issue. Whoever wants to simplify it will, I believe, is overly simplifying a situation. It is a complex issue, but we're tackling it day in, day out. With a commitment, our commitment is that these reforms that we're undertaking will not go away and should not go away at the end of 2022. These are permanent reforms that need to continue on the path beyond 2022. And as I said, early on, because the progress wasn't seen, because things weren't seen on the ground, yes, a lot of people can criticize and can pile on the criticism. But 7 years on, progress is being made and it's being recognized. And one of our most ardent, unwavering critics today recognizes that. ITUC recognizes that progress. And that, if nothing else, that in itself, that progress for us to be held as a benchmark in terms of worker welfare reforms in a region that is not known for that, in a region that is not known for being open to its critics and welcoming its critics on its own country. Human Rights Watch launched report after report in Qatar, and they're still allowed to come into Qatar. Amnesty International launched their report in Qatar. ITUC and Sharon Borough unfurled banners outside of our building saying our World Cup is built on the blood of blood of victims and so on in Qatar. Everybody had the security, felt the security and the comfort of coming into my country and criticizing my country and criticizing us from my country. That transparency, that level of transparency, that level of willingness to being criticized and willing to engage and commit towards making progress and moving forward, if nothing else, that in itself should make it our World Cup. In the sense that that World Cup has pushed forward a movement that the region generally does not embrace and does not engage in. But leaving aside that issue, which is a significant issue for us, which is a significant progress and a leap that we've made. I was talking to James early on where we talked about the unifying power of football, and I know James has a different opinion. He doesn't think football unifies us, and I disagree, but I'll explain to you how I disagree with it. The World Cup can serve as a kickstarter for industries. The hospitality industry, the sports services industry, the technology that comes in. And there's a lot of talented people within the Middle East that don't really get a great opportunity. If they don't get it, if they do get somehow local opportunities, they definitely don't get regional opportunities. So recognizing that, we launched an initiative which we called Challenge 22. And the initiative basically aims at supporting entrepreneurs and innovators within our region. Young entrepreneurs, young innovators, finding different ways of providing support. So Challenge 22 effectively launches every year challenges, whether it's in the Internet of Things, whether it's on worker welfare, one of the years was, whether it's on hospitality industry, different challenges that we have, services that we think, or products that we think we need for the World Cup. And we launched this throughout the Arab world. The winners, they get support, financial, as well as being incubated within one of our institutions. And more importantly, they get a commitment from us that we will be utilizing their products or their services in the World Cup. So offering them a platform that can launch them into a regional, at least a regional, if not a global market for sports services. The engagement that we've had throughout the region has been mind-blowing. The ideas that have been coming on board, the excitement that people have of being part of this global event, and their products potentially reaching, at the very least, breaking away from their local markets and actually having a bigger market, and the possibility that that offers them as an SME, as a small and medium enterprise, you see that excitement in them. We just finished our Challenge 22 initiative just about 2 weeks ago. And the amount of young people that are, and the winners, and even the losers, the ones that did not qualify, just the amount of excitement that they had about this World Cup and the potential opportunity it has to offer them in their businesses and what this might mean for them in their future is inspiring.
Hassan, could we pass to James? Because we're running out.
I will pass to James, but I mean, honestly, I don't mean to speak too much, but I'm not going to lie to you, because the question is very loaded and it's a very big question. And I think I do apologize to everybody if I am boring you, but I think I'm here to answer your question. So bear with me. Yes, I speak a lot. Maybe that's how I got the 25 members to vote for us. I never shut up until they voted for us. I'll finish, fair enough. I'll close it very quickly, but by saying, fair enough, then I can't get into all the other initiatives that we've launched. But every initiative that we've launched is not related to infrastructure only. It's not related to operational elements for the World Cup in 2022. We've addressed worker welfare issues. We've addressed educational initiatives such as Jasur, and actually offer people ways of improving themselves within the sporting industry. Challenge 22 for entrepreneurs and supporting the entrepreneurial movement within the Middle East. Generation Amazing, where we've actually had one of the closest stories to my heart, is a young lady in Pakistan through Generation Amazing, who before was not allowed to participate in football, ended up becoming a leader in her community, launching the first women's league in her community, and actually becoming a spokesperson for the local NGOs against violence within her community, as a direct result of Generation Amazing, a program that we launched. We've actually launched also the Accessibility Forum, an initiative, the first of its kind in the Middle East, of engaging with the disabled people, physically disabled and the mentally disabled within our region as well. And how can we get them to not only participate as fans, but also participate as volunteers and people operating the World Cup with us. And when we opened our first stadium, Khalifa Stadium, we launched the first of its kind sensory room in the Middle East to allow for the mentally disabled children and people to be able to participate be able to engage in the matches in a safe environment. And when the mother of one of these children actually came to us and started saying that for the first time she actually felt that she could take her child to a football match in a safe environment, it's stories like these, it's initiatives like these that are far deeper than just being a tournament or being a football match for 45 minutes each way. I say this, and I know that, we've got 10 minutes, I got to let James talk about it, but this is my issue. I don't have enough time to show and explain to you what we do. But what I will tell you, if you want to really know how can this be your World Cup, and I say it to every single person in this room, visit us. Come to us. See what we have. Come with your cynical views, ask us, question us, take us through the 5th degree, do whatever you need to do. But come. See what we are and see who we are. We're not cynics and we're not people that are looking at this as a political power play. It is not a political power play. If it was, trust me, it wouldn't be worth it. I can assure you it would not be worth it. It's much more than that. It is stemming out of a belief that, like everybody else here, we want to make a change and we want to leave a change, and we are leaving a change gradually. And as I said, my invitation is open to all of you and any of you. Come to Qatar and see what we have to offer, and then pose the questions that you have.
James. Let me, Christopher, just answer in stenography because of time reasons. First of all, I'm, contrary to Hassan, a cynic, or in any case, a hard realist. The first time that I wrote about migrant workers was in 1976, and I recall describing Kuwait as an apartheid state. Let's face it, we've all known about migrant workers in the Gulf, and it took the World Cup to get it on the agenda. I'm not quite sure what our World Cup or their World Cup means. I would take issue with the concept, yes, it's being held in per capita income, the world's richest country, but it's not the people anywhere from the slums who are going to visit or attend a World Cup, wherever that may be. It's the middle class and up. And the visitors to Qatar, and I think you will get a different demography, and that's part of the problem with Qatar. And there's, as I've indicated, I personally am more or less convinced that there was wrongdoing in the bid, despite what Hassan says. and there's no question about the migrant issue. I'm still, have always been, despite that, in favor of holding the World Cup in Qatar, for the very reason that I think that you've had the beginnings of a process of change. You can argue that change hasn't gone far enough, and I would agree with that. You can argue that there's no guarantee that it will be taken to its conclusion. But nonetheless, that's more than you can say about a whole bunch of World Cups and other mega events. And that, to me, is a much more important issue.
Okay. Do we have time for another couple? Sorry, 2 more questions. Andreas.
I already have the microphone, so.
Okay. No, I'm just saying afterwards you got to go.
Can we try and keep the questions?
Yeah, I have 2 short questions.
Ownership, yes.
For Thawadi. My name is Andreas Elios. I'm a freelance journalist from Norway. First, in what way did you collaborate with Russia in the bidding process until...
Russia?
Yeah, that's the first question. And the second is, have North Korean migrant workers ever helped build World Cup venues in Qatar? Thank you.
Well, the question about Russia, we did not collaborate with Russia. Simple answer. But just to be clear, we all engaged, we all met people. I mean, we had a great relationship with the Russian bid, we had a great relationship with the Belgian-Holland bid, with Rot and Pierre van Hooydonk and all these guys. But collaboration, there was no collaboration. In relation to North Korean workers, as far as I'm aware, none of them ever worked on World Cup stadiums and World Cup projects. At least none that are under the Supreme Committee remit. And I think a question was posed to the government about other infrastructure projects. And as far as I recall, but I don't recall 100%, but I don't think there's any North Korean workers there as well. But I can tell within the Supreme Committee, as far as I'm aware, there's no North Korean workers in the Supreme Committee projects.
Okay. Down here, please.
Thank you. Nikki Dryden. What percentage of women are on the Supreme Committee, and what percentage of women and girls are receiving all these programs, including the innovation grants in Qatar?
Percentages, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not very aware of the percentages. What I can tell you, simply put, is, for example, the person that's leading the Jasur Institute is a lady. Her name is Afra Naimi. The person who's in charge of the communication department within the Supreme Committee is a lady, Fatma Naimi. The person who's in charge of stakeholder engagement and infrastructure stakeholder development is a young lady by the name of Fatma Fakhro. Honestly, in terms of percentages, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but what I can say, in let's say Challenge 22, we had, I think, 6 winners. Six or was it 7 winners? 6. I think we had 6 winners. Out of the 6 winners, I think 2 or 3 were women-led teams, if I'm not mistaken. But no, most definitely, we are engaging in women football, for example. We're supporting initiatives in relation to women's football. Our initiatives, as I said, in Jasur Institute does have an element of, I won't call it women empowerment per se, but definitely looking at engaging with and providing more support to women. But I just want to point out maybe one thing that might not be clear. For the state of Qatar, for a lot of people who assume that women are repressed in the state of Qatar, one of the role models, our role models, is Her Highness Sheikh Hamoza, who was the person who, she's the current emir's mother. And she was the final presenter in our final presentation. When we presented our bid, I think we were the only bid that actually had a woman part of the final presentation. I don't think anybody else participated, or at least participated in any meaningful way. Women's rights are very much at the forefront of Qatar's progressive development. We were the first country in the GCC to have a women minister. Currently, I think there's about 2 or 3 representatives in the in the advisory council that were appointed by His Highness the Emir as women. I feel like I'm trying to explain what Qatar is about, but I think again, I would welcome you to come to Qatar, meet go ahead to Qatar Foundation, look at Qatar Foundation, which is the educational city that hosts educational institutions from all over the world, in particular the US, Georgetown, Carnegie Mellon, and so on. And I think when you see the amount of women in leadership roles, you begin to understand, I think, more, rather than me giving you a percentage, I think you'll be able to understand more in terms of women engagement and women empowerment in the state of Qatar. I'm hoping I answered your question. It's not numbers, not directly, but I fail to have numbers, so I apologize for that.
There is actually one percentage which is interesting, and it's interesting particularly because Qatar is the only other Wahhabi state on earth.
I'm not Wahhabi, by the way, just in case.
But Qatar also has the highest percentage of women in the workforce, and it's 51% worldwide, which is quite interesting.
Qatar has traditionally been one of the last countries to send women to the Olympics.
It was one of the last,
and
but in terms of the workforce,
very few women still compete for Qatar in
absolutely.
international sport. So, I mean, it's very historical that women's participation in the sporting environment is low.
Sorry, I think on a professional level, yes. You are right, on a professional level. On a recreational level, no, that's not the case. They're actually quite active and quite participant. My sisters played football up until they decided to quit themselves out of their own volition, not to continue. And we do have a women's league that we try to support as well. But I do agree with you, on a professional level, yes. But that is gradually changing. I think gradually we are getting more and more women participating in professional sports. But in terms of sports administration, in terms of being part of the workforce, and thank you for giving me that statistic, in terms of leadership roles within, whether it's a Supreme Committee or otherwise, no, we are, I won't say we're ideal or perfect, but we are definitely quite progressive on that matter.
Okay, thank you. I'm really sorry that's all we have time for. The session's over. Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, James Dorsey.
They ended it, so I do apologize for that.
Well, we could try and barricade him in, but...
And it's all my fault. I have the ingracious task of ending this discussion just as it has begun, really gained spirit. I would like to thank you, Hassan Thawadi, for prioritizing this event, for sharing your thoughts. I think we can see you have an obvious commitment to this, and I think we have seen a very good example of unfolding a discussion in respectful disagreement. It has been a very, very interesting hour and something more. So thanks to the panel. Thanks to James also for controlling it. I have some important, short, practical notes. If you have not registered yet, please do so. And if they forget to ask you about which social events you're taking part in, please tell them yourselves. It's because we have lost a lot of information about who is taking part in social events, and it is actually quite important for us to know whether there's 150 or 275 going with the buses and to the restaurant in Eindhoven tomorrow. We think it'll be 275, but the closer you can help us to a correct figure, the better. Those of you who will speak in this room, please go to the technicians like 10 minutes before the session starts, and that's 10 minutes before the session starts, to get mic'd up with the headsets. We have been able to be very generous with delays this afternoon because we have this welcome reception that is a good buffer, not only buffet but also buffer. But we don't have the same generosity the other days, and it will all collapse in chaos if we do not start sessions on time. This night at 8 o'clock, you will have a session here on sexual abuse, a very, very topical issue these days, and how to prevent it with a number of very good speakers and stakeholders. And in the opposite room, the design saal, the design hall, just opposite this room, you will have, for those of you who are interested in sports governance, you will have revealed the more detailed results of the National Sports Governance Observer. We just issued a press release, I think, and we can give you some preliminary results and some reflections from Brazil, Poland, Netherlands, other countries about how sports governance is evolving. And now it's my pleasure to invite you, or rather, I'm not allowed to speak on behalf of Eindhoven City, but I think they would appreciate I mention it. They have actually offered the welcome reception. It takes place in the room next to us, the north part of this room. So please enjoy the food and the welcome by Eindhoven City. Thank you. See you at 8 o'clock.